Welcome everybody for today's webinar for the Nottingham Derby branch BCS. We are going to be listening to Andy, and he's going to be giving us a talk on COVID-19 lessons learned from an aggressive cloud migration strategy. Before we get started with Andy, I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping. I'd like to first of all introduce a new item, which is an inclusion and diversity questionnaire that our inclusion and diversity officer would like participants to take part in. So I'm going to show this QR code for a few moments, allow you to get time to take your phones out so that you can photograph this. Alternatively, you can go straight to the URL that is presented. I'm also going to enter this into the chat window and give everyone a chance to visit the URL. And we ask that you complete the questionnaire during the period of the presentation, and that will allow the Inclusion and Diversity officer to better prepare for sessions in future and for interesting things in the future. I'm going to paste that into the chat window in a moment. And in the meantime, I'd like to show a couple of polls. We have our usual polls. They are asking questions that are relevant to how you found out about the session and also if you're a BCS member. So in a moment, I'm just going to show the first poll. And on your screens, you should now be presented with a question asking if you're a BCS member or not. Give you a few moments to select the result. Okay, it looks like we got all the answers there. I'm going to close the poll now. Thank you. I will share that with you so you get an idea of the attendance. So we got 67% are BCS members. That's a good turnout. But more interestingly, we've got 33% which are non-members. That's great. Right, I'll now show the second poll. So how did you hear about this event? I'll give you a moment to choose your option. Results coming in thick and fast. Okay, looks like we've got all the answers. And I'll show you the results. So it looks like emails are getting quite a number of the attendees here, and of course from the BCS website. That's great. Thank you very much for taking part in that poll. Right, Andy will stop for a few questions during the talk. Please write your questions in the question panel and I will read them to Andy when he is ready. Any outstanding questions will be read out during the interactive Q&A session at the end after Andy has finished the majority of his presentation. So with that said, I would now like to hand over to Andy, who will deliver his presentation.
Excellent, thank you very much. Right, so just let me share my screen and switch to this one, I think. Okay, so can you see my presentation okay?
Yes, we can.
Excellent, cool. Okay, so I'm going to talk about Juniper and our experience of the COVID-19 kind of epidemic and how our aggressive cloud strategy assisted us in this particularly unique situation. It's a very interesting situation because I guess as many of you know, we spend a lot of time building IT systems with disasters in mind and the idea that things might go wrong one time, but we very rarely get to test those kind of contingency plans, and so this is a kind of a unique opportunity to do that. So just a little bit of information. So as it says on screen, my name is Andy Edwards. I'm what we call internally a senior group architect. And this basically just means that I have a view of the entire IT landscape across applications, infrastructure, and everything else. I tend to get involved in anything particularly difficult or interesting. I have a background which is around, so I started my IT career in infrastructure, then switched over to development, and then kind of switched back to infrastructure again. So I have a nice wide kind of experience set, and at the moment my kind of focus has been cloud and IoT to some extent. So tend to get involved in these kind of newer areas and the interesting kind of bits and bobs. Juniper, for anybody who's not aware, so Juniper is an energy company. It was formed several years ago when E.ON, the energy company, split into two. So E.ON was what we call a vertically integrated energy provider. That basically means that they both generated the energy and then they sold the energy to the retail companies, to the retail customer. And it decided a few years back that it wanted to split the generation business. And they were a little bit kind of, they cut the business up in different ways, but it broadly kind of equated to anything that generated power and was considered not green went to Juniper, and everything else then stayed with E.ON. And at the time, this gave us a really interesting opportunity because we were effectively being carved out of a larger company. However, we had no pre-existing IT to be carved into. And what this meant was that we got to build up our core IT fresh. And that meant that we could do some very interesting things from a strategy perspective, from a technology perspective, and moving forward. And as you can kind of see from this slide, we are Europe-wide, and we are also outside of Europe. So most of our emerging business is outside of Europe, but our kind of core employee base is internally within Europe. And for the sake of this presentation, the interesting thing is that we have about 11,500 employees. And when we talk about our COVID controls and what we did here, we're mostly talking about we are talking completely about the non-control of power stations. So the power stations have their own control networks, and those are self-contained entities. So we're talking more about the enterprise IT rather than the particular power stations themselves. So what I'll do now is just go over a brief introduction of some of the terminology I'm going to use, especially within the context of what we did at Juniper. The reason for this is that one of the things you tend to find in cloud is that there's a lot of marketing terms that mean one thing or another thing, and they can be a little bit flexible with their interpretation. So this just gets us all on the same page. So most people who have any experience of cloud will have seen something like this before. So we have, let me just get the pointer up so we can see these a bit easier. So we have on-premise, and this is effectively what we would call a traditional data center. And effectively, you're responsible. So the green here indicates responsibility. You're responsible for all of these aspects of that data center. This is an idealist view that doesn't tend to exist anymore because most companies will outsource their data center providers to a third party. So actually, you get a little bit of this infrastructure as a service, but on this side. But as an idealist position, we have full responsibility. Then we have infrastructure as a service. So what this means is that our cloud provider will provide the networking, the storage, the servers, and the virtualization, and then we're responsible for everything else. So for all intents and purposes, these are virtual machines that sit in a cloud. Then we have platform as a service. So This means that everything up to the runtime is provided by the cloud provider. So for example, if you were hosting a website, you would be provided with the infrastructure to run it on, the OS that runs on that infrastructure, all of the middleware, the runtime, the web server that's implemented on top of that, all of that would be provided and run by and managed by your cloud provider, and then we would simply provide the database and the application on top. And then we have software as a service. So software as a service can be interpreted two different ways. So in theory, what it means is you simply configure and run your application, and everything else is provided by a third party. This can be a contractual obligation, or it can be a technology obligation. So if we look at something like Office 365 from Microsoft, the technology of the entire stack is provided by Microsoft and is run by them and is managed by them, and you simply configure your app. If you go to a third-party software as a service provider, you may find that actually their technology is just simply a number of virtual machines that sit on in a data center, but your contractual position with them is that they are providing everything up to the software and you're just providing the configuration. So it's important not to confuse the two, but within the boundaries of this presentation, when we talk about software as a service, we're effectively talking about Office 365 and Intune. Intune, or as Microsoft have now renamed this entire suite, the M365 service is important because it kind of goes with where Juniper went as part of its strategy. The second aspect to this is something called Evergreen. So Evergreen is a simple concept, but it has some quite wide-reaching implications to your organization from an IT perspective. So what this is effectively a piece of terminology that means that your software is always up to date. So many people are used to dealing with an iPhone, which is probably one of the best examples of an Evergreen platform, let's say, and every now and again you'll get an iOS update. That update is effectively applied and everything continues to work, and it's no big deal because it's a small incremental update and it happens often. Windows 10, so Microsoft's new implementation of Windows 10 or Windows as a service is the same. So every 6 months we get what we call a feature update for Windows, which has new features, and every month we get automated patches. And these are delivered directly from Microsoft. Office 365 is the same. And what you find is most cloud platforms, whether that's a piece of software delivered as a service or whether that's a web-based application, these are all evergreen, and it means that you have the same features as everybody else who uses that platform, and it means that you're as up to date as everybody else. And these changes tend to be small but constant. But the important thing is that these updates are mandatory. You have very limited control over when these happen. And you have almost no control over what happens. So what this means is you will get version X of Windows 10 at this date. You can delay it a little bit, but if you delay it too much, then you effectively go out of support with Microsoft or your cloud provider. And if anybody's ever worked in enterprise IT, you'll know that, so normally what would happen is you have this entire concept of N-1, N-2. So the support window for a particular application might be 4, 5, 6, 7 years. What we find with the cloud service providers is that the support window tends to be a year. So you need to be in whatever the latest version is -1 as a minimum. When those versions are coming out every 6 months, that means you're getting less than a year really sometimes to actually do these updates. And this change is pushed onto your organization. And the reason this has a big effect on your organization is it means that most IT in a large enterprise is delivered via a project, and a project is a predefined block of time. You have to give a cost justification, it has to deliver benefits, etc., etc. And when that project finishes, then the people who worked on that project disappear and they go on to another project and do other things. When it comes to Evergreen, it means that the change that you do normally in a project needs to exist in your organization, because every 6 months something new will happen. So you can have a project to implement Windows 10, but if you then get rid of your project organization to support the implementation, in 6 months when a new version comes out, you either have to spin another project up, or you have to have this constant level of change in your working. And this is things like checking every application every 6 months, doing compatibility testing, making sure that there's no security issues. One of the more important things nowadays, data protection issues. So what new services or features are being delivered, and do they have any data protection implications? Is the data within Europe? Is it being stored outside of Europe? And so your change organization switches really its context from being project focused to being organizationally focused and exists in its own on its own. And that actually is a bigger challenge for an organization, I would say, rather than the actual technology challenge, because most organizations are used to IT projects being delivered in the project format. So when we talk about an aggressive cloud strategy, what exactly did Juniper do? So the first thing we did is what is generally the first step into a cloud world for most large organizations, and also probably most small organizations, which is Office 365. So in a traditional enterprise, we have Exchange on-prem, and it delivered all of our email. We migrated that into Office 365 because we have some interesting data protection challenges. We went with something called a hybrid config. So this means we have an on-premise and we also have an online version, and they talk to each other. I'll talk about this a little bit later on. So the lessons learned that we feed into this kind of presentation here were based on a previous talk I did, and I'll briefly go over a summary of what we concluded in that previous presentation. But one of the things we came up with is hybrid is a bad idea. But this works. It's complicated, but it works, and it delivers Office 365. The second bit is something that's actually relatively uncommon at the moment. So it's something called Windows 10 Modern Management. And what Juniper did is that they decided to take a kind of a further thinking, or a view further into the future of where the technology space was going. And what we kind of established is that your desktop computer, your normal Windows 10 computer in a traditional enterprise is normally connected to an on-prem Active Directory. And you have things like SCCM servers to deliver software packages and update servers, and you have all of this on-premise infrastructure to access all of your on-premise applications. That's all very efficient and works really well on an enterprise network. But when we're talking about a cloud strategy, we're talking about delivering all of these services as a service, right? So we gain the value from Microsoft running them. So Microsoft run Intune for the most part. We do the configuration, they do all of the infrastructure aspect of it. And so what a lot of organizations do is they either go for a traditional approach, which is this on-prem world, or they go with a hybrid approach. So Microsoft at the moment is very much pushing this hybrid approach, which effectively means we'll take all of your technology that's on-prem and we'll connect it to the cloud, specifically the Microsoft Azure cloud, and then you'll get some benefits of the cloud, but you then get the security of the on-prem. And because organizational IT, especially for a large organization, is very difficult and slow to change, it allows you to kind of put your toe into the water. Now, what we did is, because we had no pre-existing IT infrastructure, it meant that we had no pre-existing investment in on-premise metal, effectively. So we decided to take our Windows 10 desktop all the way to the cloud. What this means is that our Windows 10 implementation does not require any on-prem infrastructure at all. So it doesn't connect to an Active Directory, it connects directly to an Azure Active Directory. It takes all of its Office and productivity from the Office 365 suite, which is online. All of its security, all of its policy management is all based around Intune and ATP, or Advanced Threat Protection from Microsoft, which is their kind of AI-based threat and endpoint protection service. We use things like Azure Information Protection, which allows us to do controls and encryption of data at source as opposed to on the endpoint. We use multi-factor authentication, which is all in the cloud. And when it comes to application distribution, we also do that using a third-party product from a company called Glucan. This product is called Realm Join, and effectively it's a cloud-based package distribution system and client, very similar to if anybody's ever used apt with the package manager with Linux, or NuGet with Windows. It has this concept of packages, and we're able to deploy applications to our devices anywhere in the world as long as they have an internet connection. So this is quite, as I said, quite a radical step. It works really well. We've had nothing but success with this particular implementation. So it's been really good, and it's been one of the main things that our end users have enjoyed. And then the final thing is from a strategy perspective, and this really was the root of our IT strategy, is to implement something called NE3. So what NE3 effectively means is that for our users, they should be able to use any device, any valid user from any location to access any of their corporate apps. And this is really there to enable users to be able to work in the way that they want to work. So what we kind of thought was that when you're in a cloud environment, it means that you and your competitors all have the same set of tools, let's say. So we all have the same tool sets. So if you want an organization that can outcompete your competitors, you're doing most of that competition based upon how good your employees are. And your employees being creative and flexible is a great thing for your enterprise. The problem is the traditional enterprise IT approach is to say, this is your standardized desktop, and on this standardized desktop, you have your standardized applications. And for each job that you do that with a standardized application in a standardized way from a standard network location, which is an office. And this clearly is not going to work in the future. It both prevents people from being efficient. It prevents them from doing a job in the way that they want to do it. And when it comes to recruiting new people, it really isn't the way that new employees want to work. So it would make us very unattractive in the long run. People want to be involved in their own jobs, and they want to have some form of commitment in it and be able to do the things flexibly for them. So by committing to this application strategy of any device, any network, any location, that allowed us to do that. But of course, that also means that we have to change our application estate, and we have to change the way that works. The biggest change in that effectively leads is from a security perspective with identity. So everybody generally knows what Active Directory is. This is where you log onto your Windows PC, there's a username and password. You then access an enterprise application, and it takes the credentials that you have on your PC and uses those credentials to authenticate to that application. That application is then connected to your on-prem AD, and it's all nice and transparent, and it knows who you are. The problem with that is it fundamentally relies upon you being on the corporate network. And most traditional enterprise IT configurations use the network as the main security parameter. So we have things like firewalls, we have intrusion prevention, we have encryption, we have VPNs, and these all exist to make sure that anything that's on the internal network is protected from the outside world, because internally, if you're in that network, then you're okay, but if you're outside, then you must be a bad person. When we try to make applications available from any device, that means that that device isn't necessarily on the internal network, and it doesn't necessarily have access to the internal network. So how do we know who the right person is, and then how do we control how that person accesses that application. How do we control or prevent them from accessing an application if they're in China, for example, and we know we have no employees in China, so that shouldn't be happening. And this is where we move to something called federated identity. So what federated identity does is it protects the application from an identity perspective per application and per user, and allows you to apply a number of different controls on a per application, per user basis. And it means that you don't have to worry too much about where the application physically sits from a network perspective. It just needs to be well developed, sitting on a public internet connection in a cloud somewhere, and it's protected and controlled. Juniper uses Azure Active Directory, which is the same platform that we use for the Windows 10 implementation, and so that's all nice and fits together. But again, this is a fundamental change to an application, and you have to modernize your application for the most part in order to support these things. These use open standards, so OpenID, for example, and these standards were developed by people like Twitter, Google, and these guys, so they're very robust. So as I mentioned previously, I gave this talk at a previous BCS meeting, and at a high level, the summaries of our experience with this were basically as follows. So hybrid is bad, it's complicated and risky and very difficult to escape. So this stems from the fact that once you have a hybrid configuration in place, it can be very difficult to then break that hybrid to move to something that's cloud only. And by binding yourself both to the on-prem and the cloud world, you effectively introduce 2 points of risk, because you have two worlds. The cloud world is this evergreen world, and the on-prem world is this traditional world, and they have different update cycles, they have different controls, and therefore where those two meet becomes a point of risk, and it's very difficult to control. The second kind of experience we had from our entire kind of cloud migration is that actually one of the biggest problems you will face, and one of the things that slows you down the most, will be your applications. You know, Juniper is an energy company. If you follow its kind of pedigree back, in both England, in the UK and Germany, we have our foundations in things like the CEGB, so the Central Energy Generation Board from the 60s, 50s, 70s. We have some applications that are so old you would not believe. And the problem with these applications is that if they're being used by the business and they rely upon a traditional infrastructure, then again they become a risk, because you've got one foot in two worlds. If you can modernize them or get rid of them, that's great, but keeping them is going to prevent you from doing some interesting things in the future, and it's also going to prevent you from delivering a lot of the value that moving to a cloud world actually is supposed to deliver. Next, we have, for large organizations, infrastructure as a service feels safe. So what you'll often hear about, especially for companies that sell cloud migration services, is something called lift and shift. So this is the idea that you can take a server that's on your private network, lift it and shift it to a cloud network, and get some of the benefits of cloud, but with none of the real effort of modernizing your application or knowing what you've got or any of this kind of stuff. Now, big organizations love this because it sounds like it's easy, and it sounds like we can get some of the benefits by just doing half of the work. Now, most people know if you don't put the effort in up front, you're really never going to get any of the benefits, and this is very true with infrastructure as a service. So what you tend to find is that you have a whole bunch of problems on-prem, but you can control those problems because, you know, let's say, for example, you have an application, it's very poorly designed because it's 20 years old, but actually you don't see any of those problems for the most part because you're on a gigabit network and all of your clients are on the same network as it, and it hides a whole bunch of internal flaws that you aren't really aware of. You then take that server and you put it into, so Juniper's particular scenario, you put it into an Azure data center. That Azure data center is in Amsterdam or in Dublin, and you have a single link to it. So now you've effectively taken a server that was fully under your control, that was very close to your users, and you've now put it onto a server that's no longer under your control, that's now in a geographically different or distant location to your users. And then you start to see things like latency issues. You start to see performance issues. You start to see credentials issues, because you then have to effectively extend your internal enterprise network into the cloud, which is always a bad idea because it's far away and you don't have that much control over it. So of course you're going to get issues. But a lot of companies do this because they think it will give them some immediate cost saving. Often it will give you an infrastructure cost saving in the short term, because bear in mind, cloud is all about subscriptions. So it's all about a service that's an ongoing cost. So yes, it might be, 100 euros a year cheaper now, but if that service stays in place for the next 10 years, you're still paying for more than maybe if you'd decommission the server and modernize the application. Then it was cloud automation delivers the most value. So automation is the key with cloud. These cloud providers will sell you an entire story about how it's cost effective and how you can scale up and you can scale down, and it means you're only being charged for the resources that you use. All of this realistically only applies if you automate. Being able to automatically deploy, automatically upgrade, removes a lot of the complexity from managing disparate systems, and it allows you to then take advantage of all of those nice cloud services. If you don't do that, then you spend a lot of your time maybe not managing the server, but having to manage a cloud service, and that cloud service is dependent upon 300 other cloud services, which you then have to manage as well, and that can become quite complicated. And then finally, with your applications, actually, if you want to get the most value with the least amount of effort, with the least amount of risk, you really do need to embrace modern cloud design patterns. Now, these design patterns are everything from the application stack upwards. So this is things like Federated Identity, Docker and containerization, Kubernetes. If you get into that space and your applications are able to be modernized to that level, then it's pretty impressive, because you can effectively define all of your enterprise infrastructure in code. You can manage that code like you would any piece of software, so source control repository with automated deployment and things like that, and you can then effectively roll back your infrastructure, you can upgrade your infrastructure, and you can do all of this from the push of a button with very little risk, and the cost is well managed. Now, I've highlighted some in red here. So the ones that are highlighted in red are important to bear in mind when we move to the next phase of the presentation about what worked and what didn't during our COVID kind of crisis. Because the stuff that worked effectively relates to the points that we did things well in, and the stuff that didn't work effectively map to the places where we only went halfway into the cloud. And it's kind of supports the position from my previous talk to say, actually, our assessment of what we did well and what we didn't was quite accurate, and now here's the proof. So at this point, I'm just going to ask, are there any questions on what I've spoke about so far? Because I realize that it can be quite complicated at the moment, and especially when we come to the cloud terminology and some of the implementations, it's a little bit abstract.
Okay, thank you, Andy. So far, we have no written questions that I can read out to you, so please feel free to carry on. And when we get to the end, we'll ask people to raise their hands, and I will unmute them, and they are free to ask their questions. So carry on, please.
Excellent. So I'm going to take the lack of questions to mean either I've lost everybody or you're all cloud experts. So let's move on to the next thing. So COVID-19. So Juniper, as an organization, decided on Friday, the 13th of March, that the following Monday, all of its users would work from home. So this is any office staff, all the central functions, our trading functions. This is offices worldwide, Most of our staff are located in Germany and in the UK, but we have people all over. So you can imagine that the weekend of the 13th of March was an interesting weekend. We kind of knew that something like this would be coming, but we were a little bit surprised how quickly it happened. This was 1 week before the German official lockdown, and this was 2 weeks before the UK official lockdown. So it wasn't, we didn't expect it as soon, but we went with it. So what that meant is that on that Monday morning, we had 11,000 users who would be switching on their laptops from home and trying to connect to all of the various applications and services that they need to do their job. And that all needed to work. So what went well? So you can see a diagram on screen. Now, the reason for this diagram is effectively to provide some context of what I'm going to talk about next. What we have here is effectively a high-level kind of abstraction of how Juniper interacts with the Microsoft Cloud, and this is the same for 99.9% of enterprise organizations. So what we have is, on the left-hand side, we have the enterprise network, and this is a traditional enterprise network where we have somebody who wants to connect to an application or service internally. They connect into the network, usually through a VPN, and then they consume on-premise services transparently as though they're sitting on the corporate network. We then have on the right a cloud data center. So for Juniper, we're pretty much a Microsoft shop. So this is all Microsoft Azure. And so we have the Microsoft Azure cloud, and they have edge appliances which allow us to effectively route traffic in based upon the geographical location of the requesting user. And a user who needs to access, let's say, for example, a application that has been modernized and pushed into the cloud would come straight into the Microsoft data center and access that application. And their access to that application would then be dictated by conditional access rules, which sits inside the Federated Identity. And then, because even though we took a very aggressive cloud strategy, we were still cautious in certain areas, and we still did some infrastructure as a service, and we still did a few things that were half in the cloud and half in the on-prem world. We then have this connection in the middle here. So what this is this is a network connection from the Juniper enterprise network connecting over the internet using VPN or ExpressRoute, which is just a dedicated connection to Microsoft, and then connecting into the Microsoft global network to then consume services here or to access servers that are located here. So what this means is that depending upon the location of an application, a user might go in through a VPN to the corporate network, through the Microsoft cloud, or in some areas, a bit more of a longer path, which we'll talk about in a sec. So now we have the high level understanding of how the Juniper network is configured and what's involved. If we jump to Windows 10 and Office 365, so Monday morning, our 11,000 users turned their computers on, connected into their email, connected into Teams, and everything just worked. And this was quite a surprise. So most of our users were expecting to have significant connectivity issues, not being able to connect to anything, and to maybe have PC problems. But actually, all of this just worked, and all of this just worked because if we go back to this original diagram, when we talk about the Windows 10 and Office 365, they're all connecting straight into the Microsoft world. They don't need to go via the enterprise network for any of their core services. They just drop straight into the Microsoft world. And because it turns out Microsoft has better IT people than us, and it has more money than us, and it has thousands and thousands of customers, it meant that where we did see problems, Microsoft solved those problems for us. So one of the interesting things is if you think on day one of lockdown, you had not just Juniper's 11,000 employees working from home, but worldwide, Europe-wide, UK-wide, we started to see hundreds of thousands of people working from home. And because of that, Microsoft took some pretty impressive scaling strategies to deal with it. So an interesting example, so we experienced some small issues. Most of the small issues were around being able to send chat messages and presence information. So understanding if somebody was online, offline, busy, or in a meeting. What Microsoft did is that they, in order to free up resources on their Azure cloud, they deprioritized the resourcing of admin tasks. So things like me as an admin being able to create a new mailbox, instead of that taking 10 minutes, they deprioritized it so that it took 20 minutes. We have reports, so reports, instead of updating every hour, were updated every 24 hours. And by doing this, Microsoft were able to free up huge amounts of additional resource in their cloud and then dedicate that resource to filling the holes the new influx of users were creating. And this effectively meant that actually from day one, as an organization, from a productivity suite, so email, online meetings, all of those kind of things, we were able to work from day one. Now, anybody who has worked with a traditional office setup, so where you're pulling your email, for example, from an internal Exchange server, knows that that's really impressive, because normally in this world, you'd have, in this traditional world, you'd have to connect to a VPN, and then from that VPN go through and connect to all of the other services. So next we have the enterprise apps. So it's all well and good being able to access your Windows 10 device and get your email and do your meetings, but if you can't access any of your applications, then you can't do a lot of your job. So we have three types of applications. We have modernized cloud apps. These are the ones that go direct into the cloud. These were hosted platform as a service or software as a service. They use the public internet as their main connectivity point, and they use Azure Active Directory for their authentication. All of these applications just worked. Because the user is using their own internet, if we had a user who was unable to access an application, it was almost always down to their local internet connectivity. It wasn't a central problem. That meant that we had no support load having to deal with these applications, because all of that support was then shifted to the application owners for the particular app. This was great, because what it meant is that the majority of our users, because the majority of our apps had been modernized, could actually just get on and do their jobs. And again, this was a really surprising situation for our business. IT, we knew that this would probably work. This is why we modernized, and this is why we went to the cloud, but the business were pretty shocked. So that was great. We then had traditional enterprise applications. Now, the big issue around these kind of applications is you have to go into your internal infrastructure in order to consume things. And what we found is, as we had more and more users trying to access these applications, more and more of these applications failed. And I'll go into why they fail a little bit later, but this experience was not great. The final type of application is the lift and shift. So you can kind of see that actually you've kind of broke both of the models by using the lift and shift application, because not only do we need to go into the corporate enterprise, we then need to go back out again to something that's already on the public internet anyway. It makes very little sense, and the reality is lift and shift is a bad idea no matter what you think. But if you're a traditional enterprise, it makes you feel a little bit more secure, because it uses terminology and it uses processes that you understand. You know, you feel secure because you're using a VPN which you know and trust to connect to Microsoft. The fact that actually an application that's going via the internet and using conditional accesses using SSL encryption and has the same protections as a VPN doesn't really matter, because people feel like that's not trustworthy, but a VPN is something that you can trust. And again, we have the same problems with these applications, because step one, when trying to access one of these apps, is once again, get me onto the corporate network. So main problems. I think most of us probably understand the main problem is going to be VPN, right? So VPN is a set of appliances, and it allows you to create a virtual network between your Windows 10 client and the enterprise network, and make your client appear as though you're on the enterprise network. The problem here was two or threefold. So because we'd modernized most of our applications, we only had about 2,000. We'd only scaled the infrastructure for 2,000 users. It was never scaled for 11,000 users. And it was a good job that we'd never scaled it for 11,000 users, because 80% of the time we'd be paying for infrastructure that we never use, because we never expected 11,000 users to actually use it. But not only that, you also then have to understand that the VPN infrastructure has support services as well. So it has its own DNS. It needs bandwidth in order to support all of those users. It needs certificate servers in order to authenticate those users, and et cetera, et cetera. So what we found is that actually the more users who use the VPN, the more that infrastructure started to crumble. The more users you get on there, the more latency that was introduced. Then when you consider you then need to jump, so for an infrastructure as a service application, you then need to not only jump onto the corporate network, you then have to jump over a constrained network into the cloud as well. And this caused huge issues. Now, thankfully for Juniper, actually, because we'd modernized most of our applications, there was very few applications that actually required this configuration. Unfortunately, the ones that did are the core trading applications, because trading has very strong restrictions on where trading activities can happen. They can only happen in regulated locations. Those rules were changed because of COVID, but it meant that the application owners for the trading business had never thought about moving their applications into a state where you weren't on the internal network. So what we found is during this particular crisis, actually 90% of the support effort that we were providing was actually to 10% of the application base. It just happened to be a quite important 10%, which was the trading application. Actually, the rest of the business was able to operate perfectly well because they were all on cloud-based applications. It had effectively removed all of that support load from us, because most of the dependencies were actually in the user's own control. They were the user's internet connection. So if you imagine a situation where we didn't have those trading applications, actually we would have had a fully working business with no IT issues, that on a Friday went home and on a Monday all worked from home, that automatically scaled, that was supported, that worked, and an entire business that was functioning in a completely different model in the space of 2 days, because we had modernized our applications, and because we had modernized our services around the cloud. And really what we find is, of course, these are the benefits that the cloud providers sell to us, but nobody ever really tested any of it. Nobody ever really tested any of it in a large organization. It's very easy for an organization of 50 people to run on Office 365 and do everything that they need to do. But when you have 11,000 people worldwide, when you have 11, 12, 13, 15,000 laptops deployed across the business, you're never quite sure whether any of this stuff would actually work. And actually, from a conclusion from our perspective was, it works really well, assuming you actually do what you said you did, which is modernize your app, push it into the cloud, don't stay on-prem. Now, the reason why I thought this talk was quite a good talk to give is, so not only is it interesting to see where the cloud worked and see that actually it does, and to see, you know, where our pain points were, and actually as a narrative, our pain points were very small and not that much went wrong, which is surprising. We know that we have competitors, for example, that were unable to work for 1 or 2 weeks after lockdown because they were unable to get all of their users into a position where they were working, because they were using a traditional approach. These approaches where, even though they were using Office 365, you still had to connect to a VPN in order to get an internet connection that was secure to then connect to Office 365. So you were then driving traffic internally. And what this did is this led to a very unique situation for an enterprise IT department. What this led to was, publicly on on places like LinkedIn. So if you look up our CIO, Damien Bunyan, you'll see he gave many interviews with various organizations in Germany because our IT worked. And a lot of people were surprised. We had people on LinkedIn from various parts of the business thanking us for the way that our IT worked. Now, anybody who's worked in IT support before will know that it's quite a strange thing to have to have a business actually thanking the IT department for doing the things that it did. These are some of the publicly published comments. Internally, those comments were even more impressive. We had people saying to us they now understood why we forced them to migrate. They now understood why we were forcing the business to modernize their applications. We had a number of departments that said the only reason we had won contracts, the only reason we were effective and that we outplayed our competitors is because we were in a position where all of our IT worked. All of our applications were working. It meant that we could issue contracts, we could get money, and we could deal with all the various parts of the business. And really, for me, this is what you want when you put together a new strategy, when you put all of that effort. So this has taken 3, 4, 5 years to do. Being in a position where your business is actually telling you as an IT organization you've done a good job, and not just because you've finished the project on time. You've done a good job because the worst thing happened that could happen and it actually worked. That's a really great position to be in, and it's one of the few times I've been very proud of my organization, because while they can be very demanding, it was nice to actually be appreciated when the time was right. So in summary, if we revisit the kind of things that the points that I found on my previous presentation, if I was to summarize the learning points from what we did is cloud platform as a service and software as a service. It works as advertised if you do it right. Leave the scaling and the resource management to the experts. You don't need to be investing in thousands of euros worth of metal for your data centers being able to scale things up and down. You don't need to do that if you follow the cloud patterns. Cloud will deliver the value that it says it will. You just can't do a halfway house. You have to be in it 100%. And that is end to end. That's your client, that's your productivity suite, that's your applications, that's your identity, that's everything. If you have something that's on premise, then you will always have a point of risk, because that switch from the on-prem world to the cloud world is where things go wrong. If you get the desktop and productivity right, your users are going to love you, right? So it always comes down to this. Users will complain about the thing that affects them the most, and the thing that they interact with the most is the laptop. It's the Office suite. It's their online Teams software, and it's accessing those kind of intranet applications and things like that. If you get that stuff right, most users will be very understanding if every now and again they can't access the HR system because their certificate isn't working. If their email works, if they can have a conversation with their colleagues, that's 90% of the battle won. Again, it comes back to my previous points. Your application estate will hold you back. All of the problem applications we had were the applications that were on-prem. We had applications that had been half modernized. So this is where they were on an infrastructure as a service server in the cloud, but you, for example, had to use a remote desktop to access it. The performance on a remote desktop over a VPN during a worldwide pandemic, of course, is relatively bad. And people are then surprised when these things don't work. If you'd modernized your application, it would work perfectly. If you don't modernize it, or you cheat. So we have a lot of applications where they say, yes, it's in the cloud, it's modernized. It's not. It's located in the cloud, but you haven't done the identity, you haven't done the public access. Cloudifying your application, modernizing your application is more than just putting it on a server in the cloud. Half measures don't work. Be 100% cloud or 100% legacy. I'm an architect. I understand IT meets requirements, and there are absolutely some real world requirements where you need something on-prem. The point is you need to understand what the compromise is. You need to limit the amount of on-prem that you do to a small amount as possible, or stay traditional, stay all on-prem, because then from an investment point of view, you can invest in the right amount of infrastructure to support your situations. But you need to accept, if you're doing disaster planning, you may have to pay for 10,000 VPN licenses when day to day in a normal part of the business, you may only use 2,000 of them. However, upfront investment for that one time a global pandemic might happen. That's why we do disaster recovery. If you don't want to do that, if you want to take the advantages of cloud, then move it all to the cloud. And that's pretty much it from me. I realize that's a bit of a whistle-stop tour across all of the things that we did. But really, high-level summary, if it's on-prem and you've got a VPN, you're going to have problems when overnight thousands of people try to access it. If it's in the cloud and it's a modernized application, everything works really well. Please, if you're in an organization or you're doing a cloud migration at the moment, which most organizations will be doing some form of, push to go all the way, because actually in the long run, it delivers the benefits that you expect it to, and it doesn't compromise the models effectively. That's it from me, I think. Are there any questions?
Yes, thank you very much, Andy. We have 2 questions queued up and we've got 2 minutes left. So let's take one of the written questions that arrived first. It's from Olivia. The question is, if we go directly through Microsoft, then what was corporate network needed for?
That is it's a great question. So realistically, if all of your applications are going straight into Microsoft and you have modernized all of your applications, you actually get to a situation where you don't really need a corporate network at all. Your corporate network actually, in a fully modernized scenario, only exists to provide an internet connection inside your corporate offices. The problem is that an organization like mine is still uncomfortable, or it has legacy applications that it still hasn't modernized. And because they are legacy, it means that they then need all of the services around them in order to support them. So if I have a legacy web app, that web app then needs an on-prem AD server in order to do identity management. If it has an on-prem AD server, it then needs an on-prem DNS server and DHCP server. And suddenly you end up in a situation where you have 2 sets of infrastructure simply to support a single application. So Olivia is right, but in this transitional world, it's quite hard to get to the state where you don't really need the network. In the future, that's exactly where we hope to end up. But in order to get there, all of our applications need to have been modernized.
Great, thank you. We still have one other question remaining, so I'm going to call on Ryan. Ryan, I'm going to unmute you. Would you please ask your brief question? Hello, Ryan. Ryan, you're unmuted. Okay, sounds like Ryan is. Hang on, it's okay, right.
Sorry,
he's
no
just
question.
written. Yeah, sorry, no question. Okay, since there are no other questions, I'd like to thank you very much, and also thank the audience for attending and for the question that has been delivered to us. All that remains is for me to share something, make myself presenter. Okay. I'm still getting used to this platform. You can tell I work for Cisco and I'm used to WebEx. So let's see. Okay, so the next session will not be in, where are we? Would you like August? We're not having a session in August because we usually break for the summer period. So our next session will be on the 21st of September. The title is another COVID-19 title. It's Lockdown, COVID-19 and Coping. How did the modern cloud workplace cope? And that's going to be delivered by Gareth Naylor. So please look out for all of the announcements that will follow in due course, and wish you a good rest of the day. And again, once more, thank you very much to Andy for delivering a wonderful presentation today. Thank you, and goodbye.